Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode. Very excited about this one because we are being joined by Tom, who is the CTO at Grafana. And I was at GrafanaCon earlier this year in Seattle, which was quite nice. First of all, never been to Seattle, so it was really, really nice. I love the city. And second of all, I think the conference was not just saying it because Tom is here, but it was one of the best I've been to. The reason being, Tom, there were a lot of hands-on stuff. I'm going to be frank, like I spent more time at like the project like showcase and, you had a 3D printer and whatnot than at like talks, which is like, I'm a bit upset because the talks were really nice. The workshops were really nice. I attended this drone workshop, which was quite cool. And they let me keep the drones as well. So that was cool.
I got one of those drones to take home as well, and I went to play with it in my back garden, and it flew away.
Yeah.
I haven't seen it since.
Oh.
So if someone finds a drone in East London, that might be mine.
All right. Before we get started, Tom, do you want to give yourself a quick intro? Fun facts about you. What do you do? How's How's life? Those sorts of things.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. And so I'm Tom. As Canal said, I'm the CTO at Grafana Labs. My background's in the Prometheus space, actually. So I used to work on the Prometheus project, and I built a piece of software called Cortex, which is a scalable version of Prometheus. It's another CNCF project. It became kind of Mimir at Grafana Labs, and I also built Loki, our log aggregation system, based in London. And my hobbies, when I'm not doing this kind of thing, my hobbies are 3D printing. So you mentioned the 3D printers at GrafanaCon. They're from a company called Prusa Research in the Czech Republic. And behind me actually are three of the Prusa printers, and so like they're kind of friends of Grafana Labs. We do a lot of work together, and I do a lot of 3D printing in my spare time. My wife, I have this thing called wife acceptance factor when I kind of 3D print things that my wife's like, well, that's pretty cool. And recently it's been things like pegs for the clothesline, or hooks to keep things on the walls and things. There's a lot of 3D printing around my house. And yeah, other than that, I lead the R&D efforts at Grafana Labs. So I look after our kind of our R&D team and all the projects and kind of technology that we're building. And I like to work with a lot of our customers and understand their needs and how we can help and things like that. But no, thank you for having me, Canal.
Cool. Yeah, I see you have some. Are those Legos behind you?
Oh yeah,
Well?
I'm so crazy about all the space Lego. So I think I've got pretty much every single one of the Lego space kits. I'm actually right now building the new 747 space shuttle carrier, the one that came out a few months ago, which looks like quite a good build. I'm I'm 2 or 3 bags into it right now. But yeah, I like building things basically, and Lego is cheat code.
Does Grafana give away like Legos at like KubeCon and stuff, or?
I don't think Lego Group do customized Lego. So I think I don't know this for sure, but I think whenever you see like customized Lego, it's always like knockoff Lego. So we've kind of like tried to avoid doing the knockoff Lego route. But
it's not that good.
If Lego does customized Lego and anyone knows how to hook me up, like please let me know, because I'd love to do that.
I want to start by talking about open source. And a big chunk of companies, they now rely on open source for observability. At GrafanaCon, like at your own survey, I read it said around 75% of the companies. So why do you think, what do you think is driving that shift?
So, I mean, this is a trend that like goes beyond just the observability space, right? Open source has been really kind of revolutionizing all of the infrastructure technology space. And obviously you start with the kernel and the databases and cluster schedulers and load balancers and web servers. I would actually argue observability is a bit of a laggard. Like it's one of the last kind of markets to really be, dominated by open source. Because actually kind of interestingly, many of the largest observability vendors and the most popular observability vendors are fully kind of proprietary. And that's our edge, I think. That's our opportunity, is to come in and ride the wave of open source into the observability space. I think there's a few reasons why open source in general is something we're so excited about, right? It's less nowadays, it's less about a kind of go-to-market strategy. It's less about a kind of open source business. I'm not sure it was ever about that, if I'm honest. But, for us, it's about how to build technology in the best way possible, right? The biggest, the most complicated, and the most impactful software projects in the world are all open source, you know, and again, the Linux kernel, Kubernetes, things like open telemetry, you know, all of these big complicated projects are built by very disparate groups of engineers. You know, I'm not sure it's as much the kind of lone hacker in their basement stereotype anymore. Most of these engineers are funded and have jobs and you know, have companies that pay them to contribute, like Grafana Labs. But yeah, I just think that style of developing software, you know, very much the kind of the bazaar, the cathedral and the bazaar kind of style of developing software. You have a bunch of individual contributors doing, you know, whatever they think is the best thing. You know, that wisdom of the crowds is just the best way to build software. And plus, like at Grafana Labs, we're a remote company, right? So I would say remote first, but we're really remote only, right? We have employees in over 50 countries. You know, we do not have any offices, right? And that open source style of development really encourages like best practices, you know, best practices in communication. Like everything's very asynchronous, right? It's all, you know, comments on GitHub issues and exchanging design docs and email threads, right? It encourages these really good practices around communication and documentation, which enable the remote culture that we have, right? And I wouldn't change that for a world, right? You know, this allows us to hire the best talent no matter where they live, you know, and often the thing that attracts the best engineers to come and work at Grafana Labs is the fact that, like, you know, the other jobs that they have access to all require them to go into an office, you know, in a big city somewhere, and they just don't want to do that anymore. So yeah, like there's not just the kind of the usual arguments around go-to-market and around like breaking down barriers to adoption and getting your software out in front of as large an audience as possible, you know, which I think the audience probably is very familiar with. You know, for me, like it's all about how open source enables us to, you know, enables really good development practices, enables us to build a really good team, enables us to collaborate with our users and customers more closely, right? And that's, I think, kind of really the thing that's kind of excited me the most about open source, and I think we've embraced the most. I will say, just to finish off this thought, something we've learned very recently in the past maybe 6 months about open source is in the AI space. So we launched at GrafanaCon, we launched this AI assistant embedded in Grafana that allows you to kind of build and edit dashboards, you know, run queries, you know, navigate your Grafana instance, ask questions, do root cause analysis, do a whole bunch of really interesting stuff. And we were able to build this and bring this to market very, very quickly. And we spent a while kind of reflecting on why was this something that we could do so quickly, where our competitors have somewhat struggled. And I think, again, it's open source, right? These foundation models that we're leveraging to build our assistant, they're all based on, you know, they're all trained on open information on the open web, right? And who has a lot of information on the open web about their technology? Open source projects, right? The number of blog posts, the number of tweets of examples of Git repos full of dashboards for Grafana, for Prometheus, for our technology is huge, right? And all of these models are trained on on that data, right? So they all know for some value of no, how to query Prometheus, how to build a Grafana dashboard, what the best practices are for monitoring Kafka, what these metrics exported by a given kind of open source exporter mean, right? And it means we as Grafana Labs didn't have to really do any fundamental model development to deliver that kind of agentic assistant experience in Grafana. So yeah, we've been fans of open source for 12 years since the company started, but right, I love how even recently open source is still proving to be kind of the cheat code for when it comes to some of this modern technology like AI.
Yeah, and we'll come back to AI in a minute. I want to touch on the other point where you mentioned supporting open source, projects out there. When you look at for example, the CNCF landscape, so big, n number of projects. My question is with so many open source tools out there, how does Grafana Labs decide which ones to back or invest engineering time into?
Yeah, it's a good question. Our philosophy here is pretty simple, actually. Almost all of the software we built at Grafana Labs has been scratching our own itch, right? So we're very lucky in that we run a very, very large cloud service like Grafana Cloud, right? And this gives us as a group of engineers the opportunity to, experiment and learn the best practices for running software at scale. And this means, we are probably the biggest user of our own software. But I'll tell you a story. We have our own distributed tracing project called Tempo, which is really cool. But for the longest time, we didn't. For the longest time, we were just using Jaeger internally, right? And we have this kind of mentality where we're not just going to build our own tracing project for the sake of it. Like, we're going to invest in Jaeger, we're going to use Jaeger at scale, and we're only going to build our own one if there's a reason to do things differently to Jaeger, right? So for a very long time, we used Jaeger. For a very long time, we always try and use an existing project and contribute to, and there's many maintainers of Jaeger at Grafana Labs. And it's only when the needs of Grafana Labs, or the kind of vision we have for the direction we want to take observability, it's only when that differs from the open source project that we'll consider doing our own thing, right? So generally, like, it's not a case of deciding, oh well, there's a new category out there of technology and Grafana Labs needs to build its own. Generally, we want to really contribute upstream. We want to work with existing projects like OpenTelemetry, like Prometheus, like Jaeger, and only do our own thing if the needs kind of diverge from that. So yeah, like, it's it's really through our dog fooding or drinking our own champagne kind of efforts internally, where everyone at Grafana Labs is on call, everyone's kind of involved in the operations of our cloud service, and everyone has an opportunity to use our tools, that we will go and build new things and default to open and work from there. And so it's not just OpenTelemetry and Prometheus and obviously all of our kind of first party open source projects, but we also kind of contribute to OpenCost, or a lot of the Kubernetes monitoring infrastructure, a lot of the exporters for third party systems in the Prometheus ecosystem. There's just a lot of open source tooling that isn't core to observability. Like, I could call on things like Tanker, which is our config management system we've developed based on JSONet, which is Tanker is effectively kind of the continuation of the KSonnet effort. That we just default to open. Someone asked me, like, how much of the code at Grafana Labs is open source, and so I used Cursor to build some scripts that would then go and download all our repos from our org and count the lines of code. And it's somewhere between 2/3 to 3/4 of the code at Grafana Labs is open source, right? Very, very little of our code is proprietary. And I think a lot of the proprietary code is really just like the version controlled, YAML manifests, if I'm honest, for running Grafana Cloud.
That was my question. Thanks for answering. I was going to ask that. But speaking of OpenTelemetry, right? You recently donated Bela to OpenTelemetry. So what led to that decision, and what does it say about how? I'm just curious, like, what it says about how you think about open source collaboration. I know you answered that briefly, but what basically led to this decision?
So I mean with OpenTelemetry and Bela, there's like a few interesting things going on here, right? So one is, we fundamentally believe, like, any technology you ask a customer to install on their machine should be open source and liberally licensed, right? Like, we really don't want you to install proprietary code on your machines, right? And Bela fits into that category of like technology you need to install to automatically instrument your services for OpenTelemetry, right? OpenTelemetry has a project that's similar to Bela for a long time, and this is the Go eBPF auto instrumentation project. And we wanted to do things a little bit differently with Bela, right? So, and again, it's a case of like, we want to use the upstream, we want to work with the upstream, but when our needs and desires diverge from the upstream, we'll go and do our own thing, right? And so in particular, we didn't just see the eBPF auto instrumentation as being suitable for Go or applications built in Go. We wanted it to work with anything, right? And we've actually had great success using it for Python and Ruby and and you name it, like a whole bunch of other languages that we weren't kind of expecting it would work for. And so that's one of the reasons why we did Bela. And the other reason was we wanted to integrate it. We've got a slightly different view on the agent world. Like, a lot of our customers have a lot of legacy infrastructure installed, and we 100% believe OpenTelemetry is the future, but it's kind of our job to help our customers migrate towards OpenTelemetry, and they don't really have the opportunity to start from a green field, right? So, with Alloy, which is our distribution of the OpenTelemetry collector, we've bundled in a load of non-OpenTelemetry features and made them work with the OpenTelemetry ecosystem. So I'm thinking, like, we've bundled in a lot of the Prometheus ecosystem And with Flow, our config management language in Alloy, you're able to kind of compose pipelines that consist of, Prometheus exporters and Prometheus metrics and OpenTelemetry all in one place. And so like a lot of this is, we would rather be doing all of this upstream, right? We'd rather contribute as much as we can in this space to the OpenTelemetry community. But the pace that we need to move at, like to help our customers, who have a problem now and who can't wait for, the broad church kind of agreement that's needed in OpenTelemetry, means we have to basically do things downstream and then contribute them kind of, later upstream. But our intention with almost all of our agent technology, all of our client-side technology is for it to be upstream. Like similarly with Faro, our front-end instrumentation framework for instrumenting rich kind of single-page web apps, like we would love to see that upstream in OpenTelemetry, right? We don't think it's a differentiator in this market to have, to have better instrumentation technology, right? And in particular, customers don't want that lock-in, right? They don't want to have proprietary instrumentation technology. They want that optionality to choose the best vendor, and that's worked in our favor, right? Many customers are choosing us as the best vendor in this space, but, the observability market is incredibly competitive and incredibly innovative as a result of that. And so I think we're getting chosen as one of the best competitors because we innovate quickly, one of the best vendors because we're so innovative. But we've got to, we can't rest on our laurels there. We've got to keep up this pace of innovation so that the users and customers keep choosing us.
And also, Alloy just turned 1. So what's the community feedback been like so far?
Yeah, no, good question. The Alloy was a very pragmatic project for us. Like, I think in many cases, we'd rather just be shipping a pure distribution of the OpenTelemetry collector. But as I said, Alloy contains a lot of the legacy pieces that are needed to really migrate towards OpenTelemetry. We were quite taken aback because the OpenTelemetry community did a survey of like what collector distributions do people use, and I think Alloy was the most popular non-OpenTelemetry first-party distribution. So not talking about OpenTelemetry's binaries that they ship, but rather like talking about these third-party distributions. Alloy was the most popular in the survey, and it's definitely one of our most popular open source projects if you count it by the number of hosts it gets installed on, for obvious reasons. So yeah, the feedback's been really strong, and some of the ideas for like lifecycle management for these pipelines and really blurring the lines between collector and like collector controllers and really kind of like, I think the community love some of that innovation. But as I said, like we want to see as much of that as possible upstream. Like we want to see, these ideas get contributed to the OpenTelemetry project. And we're not like, we don't think having like different or better or innovative, collection technology is a differentiator for us, right? So Ted Young, who was one of the founders of the OpenTelemetry project, recently joined Grafana Labs, not recently, about 6 months ago. And he's really leading that effort, both internally, kind of educating the wider engineering team about how to contribute upstream, but also externally, kind of smoothing over some of the road bumps to getting a lot of our technology into the OpenTelemetry project. So super excited about Alloy, and generally super excited about OpenTelemetry and this promise of kind of lower switching costs and vendor agnosticism, I guess is the word for like for our customers.
No, couldn't agree more. I think vendor lock-in is not a nice place to be.
Yeah, I mean, and that's true about all of our technology as well. Like that's the reason we make so much of our technology open source. Like we want you to use our technology, right? We want you to use our products, but we want you to do that not because because you don't have any other choice. We don't want you to to be locked into our technology because the cost of switching off of it is so high. We want you to use our technology because it's better, because we're delivering value, right? Because you're getting value from it and because it's helping you do things you otherwise couldn't do, not because you have no other choice. That's a horrible position to be in.
No, I couldn't agree more. Let's come back to AI, and obviously a lot of AI news been a few years now. It's not a new thing anymore, but at GrafanaCon, you folks keep like coming back to this idea of actually useful AI. That's what I saw at the conference. What does that mean like in practice? And you mentioned the assistant, right? So how does that reflect the actual useful AI idea?
Yeah, I think I think that the phrasing we're using around that is really trying to nod to the culture at Grafana Labs of not just jumping on the latest bandwagon and trying to capture some of that hype, right? We didn't like do a lot of work with AI, at least publicly, and we definitely didn't do a lot of work with AI in the kind of branding sense. We instead chose to try and find, places to invest that would deliver value, right? And so for the longest time, this was in the relatively, in the non like Gen AI techniques, right? In things like our predictive metrics service, which will use the profit model to predict future values of time series, right? Of any query you give it, it can predict future value, and it's really useful for things like adaptive alerting or kind of predictive auto scaling. And we've done experiments with like pattern matching in your logs, and that really went into a lot of the drill down experiences for Loki for our logs, and a lot of the kind of experiences we have around kind of making it easier to query your logs all result from this kind of pattern. We have some algorithms which emerge patterns from your unstructured logs, which are kind of cool. But when it comes to the Gen AI technologies, honestly, we were kind of struggling to find use cases for them in our space that weren't just really good demos, right? So we built like the query assistant, right, which natural language would write queries for you in PromQL, but very few people used it, and I don't think it really delivered a huge amount of value for our customers. We also built a dashboard assistant, which would like integrated into Grafana, would come in and use an LLM to give your dashboards the correct titles or the correct descriptions and things like that, and give panels titles, descriptions, and units on their axes and things like that, just making that whole thing easier. But again, not a lot of people used it. I don't think it really moved the needle. And it wasn't until the team kind of internally within Grafana Labs started using Cursor heavily, right, in this kind of agentic style of coding, that they kind of had the idea, or maybe we should build a Cursor-like experience for Grafana, where you can have that, chat assistant baked into Grafana, and you can, give it the context and tools to interact with your environment, and then ask it to do things on your behalf. And that's when we really kind of saw, okay, this is actually useful now. This is something that we think people will use, people will get value from, because it does things, honestly, like, it does what you expect. Like if you're a beginner, or just getting used to Grafana, you don't really know what you don't know, then the agent's really good, the assistant's really good at exposing you to things you might not be aware of, like best practices around monitoring, finding and helping you understand what the dashboards are trying to show you, and, exposing you to different forms of telemetry and querying them on your behalf. But the thing I think may be most surprising, and I think this has been mirrored in some of our experience with Cursor as well, is it's the advanced users that are getting some of the most value out of it, right? These are users that do know what they're doing and could do it all themselves, but they're just finding the assistant speeds it up for them, right? The assistant can build an 80-90% good enough dashboard much quicker than you can, right? And then honestly, one of the biggest issues in Grafana for probably its entire life has been like batch editing panels and dashboards, right? That we've never been able to really come up with a good UX for how to batch update dashboards, how to modify things en masse. And it turns out like the chat assistant is really good at that, right? It's really good at like, you can tell it to go and, hey, this dashboard is a legacy dashboard that someone built ages ago. Can you go and update it so that all the graphs have decent titles and the correct units and good descriptions and so on? It can do that, right? It can do that in a way we could never before. And so lots of advanced use cases are much faster under the Grafana assistant. And the final story we tell here, which I actually quite like, is the recovering engineer story, right? So I class myself as a recovering engineer. The reality is I don't get to do much coding nowadays. I'm pretty much a manager, and my boss Raj, the CEO at Grafana Labs, is the same. Recovering engineer, doesn't really get to do any coding. He's very much a manager and leader now. But we all kind of pine for the days when we could code, when we did know how to query these databases ourselves. And it's not that we've forgotten, but I don't do it on a day. I don't write PromQL queries on a day-to-day basis anymore. And I'm definitely not as fast at writing them and as accurate at writing them as I used to be. But I do know how to prompt the assistant very well, right? And it's often for people like Raj and I, it's much easier for me to work with the assistant and ask it the right question. And I could read the results quite competently, I hope. And that kind of satisfaction you get as a recovering engineer of being able to feel productive doing things that you used to be productive on is brilliant. And that's where I think the most surprise for us has come from.
Thanks for sharing, Tom. No, I really appreciate that. And speaking of dashboards, like one other thing I wanted to ask you about is in Grafana 12, you introduced a redesigned dashboard schema, right? And also the Git sync. What were like the problems that you were trying to solve with these changes? And also, quick follow up on that, what has been your favorite feature of Grafana?
Yeah, of course. So I think the dashboards as code capabilities are probably my favorite feature. And this isn't a new concept, and I don't want to pretend like we've invented the idea of version controlling your infrastructure as code, or your observability assets as code, right? Obviously, people have been doing this for years, and there's a lot of history here. I actually worked on a project using JSONet to like build dashboards and alerts and package them up and ship them and compose them together, and I think the most popular one is the Kubernetes mixin, which is like a package of dashboards and alerts for Kubernetes that's become or had become quite popular. The challenge with all of these approaches is, one, there was just a very wide range of tools available, right? Like, and there's many different ways to do this, and Grafana didn't really have any opinions about it. So, in our community, you've got people doing it every which way they want, and that leads to inconsistencies, and we don't have the resources to like invest in every single way. So one is we're trying to just kind of pick one or two ways that we're at Grafana Labs going to say is the way we support, and we're going to put our effort behind those. And obviously there's a lot of APIs, and you can still choose and do whatever you want, but we want there to be a golden path here, right? Secondly, Grafana is a very actively developed project. We're on version 12. And it's evolved a lot, but one of the things I'm very proud of is the Grafana team has a huge commitment to backwards compatibility. So you can load a dashboard from very early versions of Grafana into a modern Grafana and it will still work, right? But this has resulted, as you can imagine, in a lot of schema migrations, right? And these schemas have all been somewhat flexible, right? And these migration codes have really only ever existed in the front end code base. And so when you just want to do things, against an API, you don't get the benefit of those schema migrations, or up until Grafana 12. And so part of Grafana 12 was moving a lot of that technology into the back end, so that when you upload like an old dashboard to Grafana using a CLI tool, Grafana is going to do the work to change that into the latest version of Grafana. And then finally, the APIs generally have been pretty clunky, right? You've been able to download dashboards and upload dashboards, but like if you really want to go in and start modifying them, it can get a bit tricky, right? So we've enabled a lot more of the kind of patch style semantics in the API, so you can just modify individual bits of dashboards. And then we're wrapping the other big challenge here has been like a lot of this is hidden to Grafana users if they're only used to the UI, right? So Grafana's superpower really is that it's very easy to point and click, create, ClickOps create dashboards. And that's why you see, I think, Grafana being so popular. But at the same time, you see that kind of ClickOps approach lead to, a massive proliferation of dashboards in your Grafana instances. And how many people in their Grafana instances have like 10 copies of the same dashboard, all slightly different because someone's kind of gone in and edited it and didn't want to overwrite the original one, and so just created another copy and another copy and another copy, right? And the as code style is supposed to prevent that. But if you if you only do as code through then you make a modification and then you have to download the JSON and stick it in a Git repo and open a PR and then do the review on the big blob of JSON that's not really reviewable, and then kind of merge it and then deploy it, like you've made that whole process too hard for the user, so they're just going to go back to making a copy of the dashboard, right? So the big thing we wanted to do was kind of bring these two worlds together, right, and make it so that in Grafana you can connect it to your Git repo and you can make a modification, and then when you click save, it will go and save it into Git, open that PR, render side by side the differences on that GitHub PR, and then make it easy for you to review. Click merge, and Grafana will automatically pick up those changes and display them in the UI, and really kind of close that whole loop. So that's something we previewed for Grafana 12. The code exists, it works, it's behind a feature flag. Obviously, a lot more work to be done to make that truly seamless and work for a wider variety of users. But we really want to bring the GitOps kind of dashboards as code workflow to the masses, so that you can get rid of this dashboard sprawl that you see in many Grafana instances.
Yeah, I saw that the new app platform also supports versioned APIs, which is kind of like a big deal for developers specifically. In the survey that I mentioned briefly, the one. There was a mention of complexity, that came up as the biggest challenge. And there are features like, drill down, and we spoke about the assistant, for example. How are these features helping users cut through that complexity? And, how do you see people basically, like a shift in the way they work?
I think there's many forms of complexity, right, in this space, right? Partially from, if you just look at like the core of Grafana and what it's good at, which is like dashboarding with, data from 200 different, sources. Like there's a lot of complexity in that, like panels might be querying data in different data sources using different query language. A lot of complexity to the user from the fact that, like, you might not know how to query Elastic or Splunk, or you might only know Prometheus or Graphite, and you don't know therefore how to work with this dashboard because there's the complexity inherent from the breadth of this ecosystem. I think there's right now at least not a lot we can do about that kind of thing. We're focused mostly on reducing the complexity for Grafana when used with Prometheus and Loki and Tempo and Pyroscope. And so that's where the drill down apps come in, right? That's really moving away from this world where you have to know the query language and making, I will say these query languages are super easy to learn, right? And we've made it so that the query language for Prometheus, Loki, and Tempo are all very, very similar. So if you learn one, it's very, very easy to learn the next. And so like we've used various techniques to reduce that complexity, but fundamentally, it's a certain type of user who's willing to engage in learning, a new query language. And those that aren't, right, up until recently were just locked into consuming dashboards, not building them themselves. So those drill down apps are all about giving you a fully graphical way of interacting with the data, of drilling into the data, using the dimensionality in that data to cut, slice and dice it and find the signal you're looking for without ever seeing a query, right? And they've been hugely successful in really broadening the scope, and the adoption of Prometheus and Loki and Tempo. But I will say, like, there's other forms of complexity, right? You kind of touched on it with like these microservice architectures. In some ways, it was all much simpler when there was just a web server and all you had to worry about was QPS, and it was just a big monolith. You had to worry about QPS in the front end and maybe some database queries, and that was about it. Nowadays you need to know the architecture of the system you're trying to observe to really be able to reason about it. And that's where technology like asserts, right? We have a knowledge graph embedded in Grafana Cloud, which will, use all the telemetry signals to kind of reconstitute the architecture of your system, and not just like a service graph, but also, teams and, who's responsible for what, who's on call for this service right now, what version of, what container is it using, what hosts, what load balancers. Like we can map all of the Kubernetes entities, all of your EC2 or GCP entities into this knowledge graph and connect them all together. And it's super cool in and of its own right. And you can actually go and look at the knowledge graph yourself if you want to. But it's what we then do with that knowledge graph that I think is kind of most impressive, right? So with that knowledge graph, we can make your Grafana cloud experience much more interconnected, right? So if you're in our Kubernetes app, kind of looking at some resources, you can very quickly jump to our APM app, right? And see kind of the application view of that service. The Kubernetes view will give you, its resource usage and how many replicas it's got and what version of containers. The application view will tell you, oh, and it's doing this many QPS with this amount of latency and this error rate, right? From there you can jump into Faro and you can see the front end view of this and what the browser metrics are showing you. And so a lot of the interconnectedness in Grafana Cloud is now coming from this asserts knowledge graph. Of course, we also use the asserts knowledge graph to automate a lot of the root cause analysis, right? So if you're in the middle of an incident and you're like, what's going on? You can ask asserts and it will, using the knowledge graph, really narrow down to where it thinks the problems are within your architecture. And the great thing there is like, this is obviously something that very sophisticated SOEs just do naturally. But often they're doing it without data knowledge, right? They don't know the up-to-date architecture of the system. It might have changed last week and that change might itself be the cause of the incident that you're having. And so, yeah, the automated root cause analysis that we're doing with the asserts knowledge graph is very cool, and really helping many of our customers get more value out of their telemetry and reduce the amount of time it takes for them to to find issues in their system. And then of course, like the AI system that I referenced, like these LLMs really thrive on structure, and this knowledge graph that we've built out of your telemetry is really, curating the structure that's in your telemetry. So trying to collect an LLM directly to Prometheus or Loki or Tempo is kind of difficult because they're very, very unstructured. But connecting it to the knowledge graph gives it a lot of that structure, so it can start to reason about what's going on, much more accurately. So yeah, like they're the general approaches we've got to taming complexity. Like I think the one thing we maybe don't, put enough effort into is kind of papering over some of the cracks and presenting a very unified experience. But honestly, I'd rather focus on, the behind the scenes complexity, and I think kind of the unified experience will emerge from, the simplifications and advances we make behind the scenes.
Amazing. Well, thanks for sharing, Tom. Really nice to hear, and I'm loving this conversation. I have a few company questions, like the culture-wise, because on the website right now, I saw a banner, and then I looked into it. It says Grafana Labs was just named a leader in the Gartner Magic Quadrant and placed furthest in vision. So that's like live on your website right now. What does that mean to you personally? And like, what is, what message does it send about the, because there's like so much competition in this space, what message does it send about the future of open source in observability?
Yeah, the Gartner Magic Quadrant is one of those things where I think it shows the relative maturity of us as an organization as well. Like I think for the longest time we kind of tried to ignore its existence and focus on our kind of grassroots community bottom up motion, and that worked really well. Like that kind of what got us to where we are. But you can't help in this space but have to pay attention to Gartner, because imagine you're the CIO of a large bank. You've got thousands of decisions about technology to take, and you can't become an expert in the observability market, right? You cannot just sit and do all your own research to learn about every single observability vendor and make up your own mind. So without someone like Gartner doing that for you, you end up making decisions based on how much golf you've played with that salesperson or something like that, like badly informed decisions. So I think I think Gartner for us represents like our maturity to now be able to solve like some of the observability, the observability challenges for some of the world's biggest organizations, right? And some of the world's most complicated organizations. I've really enjoyed, I went and spent quite a lot of time with Gartner, both educating them about our products and technology. And one of the things that came out of that is like, the world doesn't really know what Grafana Labs does outside of Grafana and maybe Prometheus, right? We do a hell of a lot more. Like I talked to you about the assistant, the AI assistant. I talked to you about asserts, Loki, what we're doing with K6 and load testing and synthetic monitoring, what we're doing in the IRM space. We have a very broad platform of capabilities now. And I think that bottom-up motion we've had of like relying on our open source communities to build mindshare doesn't work when or works less effectively when you do such a broad range of things, right? So that was one of the things I learned from Gartner, is that the world wasn't really aware of how broad the Grafana Cloud platform has become, but also like they were super helpful in like a lot of how we position and explain the value that we add, right? So in particular, we have this approach called adaptive telemetry, and this is one of the things that Gartner called out in the Magic Quadrant as being relatively unique about Grafana Labs, where we will actively analyze the data that you're sending to Grafana Cloud and identify, telemetry signals you're not using or you don't need, right? And we do this based on the queries and the dashboards and the alerts you run. We do this based on your usage patterns, right? And then we will, once we've identified telemetry you don't need, we'll give you ways to, aggregate away high cardinality labels, to sample log streams, to do whatever it takes to really kind of minimize the amount of data you send to Grafana Labs. And maximize the amount of value you get out of the system, right? And our customers are regularly like halving their bills on Grafana Cloud using this technology. It's really, really effective. And Gartner really helped us like both explain that to a wider audience and explain that in a way that kind of resonates with leaders in these large organizations. So I love I've actually really enjoyed working with Gartner. It's something I wasn't expecting to enjoy as much as I did. and the kind of insight that they've been able to give me about the competition as well. I mean, I've been quoted as saying, and I'll stand by this, that I kind of try and ignore our competition, mostly because like I feel like it's too easy to pay too much attention to your competition and end up copying them and not really knowing why. I want to focus on the problems that we have internally with observability, problems that our community has, and the problems that our customers have, and try and help those. And really, we tell the engineering team and our R&D team to focus on those. But obviously, I do actually have to pay somewhat of attention to the competition, and Gartner's really helped me there, helped me kind of raise the horizon of where we look and where other players in the space are innovating. And so yeah, I've really enjoyed working with Gartner, and I do see hugely flattering to be the furthest to the right in terms of vision, and I think that's a testament to the team we've got at Grafana Labs and the culture of innovation that we've built.
Yeah, couldn't agree more about the culture aspect. I think so many companies I've seen with great tech in general, but when the leadership falls off, and it's just like a pyramid, because we're speaking about open source and commercial projects. There's this tension between a commercial company and being a commercial company and staying true to open source values. Because we've seen a lot of news okay, this open source project was owned by this company and now they're changing license or whatever, and now people are just bashing, and you know what I'm talking about. So many instances. So how do you navigate that at Grafana? Balancing between being a commercial company but also staying true to the open source values.
Yeah, it's so. I don't think open source is a business model. I don't think that's a controversial opinion, right? Open source, I've always said open source is a privilege of successful commercial organizations, right? So it's always been my priority to have a successful commercial organization so that we can continue to contribute to open source projects. The open source for us is a way of building mindshare, a way of building awareness, right? So in a lot of ways you can think of it as not money not spent on marketing, because I think many of our competitors would die for the awareness that the general audience has of Grafana in this space. But I would also say open source is more and more for Grafana Labs a way of building software, of innovating and of staying innovative than it is necessarily about the fact that the code is freely available. When it comes to a lot of other organizations choosing slightly different paths, we have tried very hard for a very long time to build a successful commercial organization that can, open source software, and the majority of its software, the vast majority of its software. And I think we've so far, up until now, touch wood, been successful at that. And that's through a combination of techniques, right? We are the majority of our core IP is under the AGPL license, right? So that gives us some extra protection over companies that choose Apache. But we also it's also not just about that, right? We have, and let's be really clear, we do have features that are not part of the open source software, right? We have, we refer to it internally as, differentiation, right? We have features, adaptive telemetry, the AI assistant, asserts, a lot of value add capabilities on top of the core visualization and databases are not open source, right? And that's key. I think if everything we did was open source, we would not be as commercially successful as we are. And then on top of that, you have to pursue trademarks. You have to pursue other ways of protecting your software, your IP as well. And it's all about just making sure that when someone does want to use your IP, in a way that might compete with you, that they come and talk to you about maybe partnering or maybe working together on things. The AGPL license, I think, still has a fair amount of kind of interpretation to be done around it. But we consider it to be a true open source license, right? OSI approved, and we welcome other vendors using our open source software. And the AGPL license makes sure that anything they build on top of any modifications they make to it, they contribute back to us, and the whole community and ourselves can benefit from that, right? That's kind of the balance between value creation in the open source and value capture with the commercial that we try and strike. But no, it's I always position this as we want to be commercially successful so we can continue to contribute to and fund the development of our open source software. You can't just do one or the other, right?
And No, I completely agree. And what advice would you have for companies who do have an open source entity but want to be commercially successful? This is not about, I don't mean like the observability space, but like companies in general.
So a few things like would come to mind here. One is your community, your open source community has to be orders of magnitude bigger than your commercial community, right? Than your customer base, right? And we're very proud that like we have like 25 million users of Grafana, but only thousands of customers. And we get those orders of magnitude because the failure mode there is if you over commercialize your open source community, then you end up killing your open source community, right? So you've got to first and foremost build a very, very large and successful open source community to be able to build a profitable business, kind of monetizing a very small proportion of that. And as with Grafana Labs, you've got to continue to invest in the open source. It shouldn't be you build a bunch of open source and then you stop and then you commercialize it. Like that will very quickly, piss off the open source community. Right. Secondly, don't just think, oh, I'm 100% pure open source company. Like I don't know, maybe Red Hat, right? Like of 100% pure open source companies that are wildly successful. Like, so you've always got to think of like, I think historically you would have called this like open core, but like, you've always got to think of, how do I both create value, build awareness for my technology and my brand, and then capture some of that value. Like, what is the reason why someone might move from my open source project to my paid project, right? We always like a lot of people will just say, oh, SSO, but I really hate the SSO tax. Like, I hate that being the default reason why people will move to the commercial product. So, in Grafana, SSO is actually part of the open source project, right? But we've tried to differentiate it. We've got SAML and LDAP in the open source project, but if you want like the first party integration that's much more proactive with like Okta, then that's the commercial integration, right? So it's always think about nuance. And finally, one of the things that Grafana Labs did in the first few years of its inception, it started building integrations that were only available commercially. So if you want the Prometheus or a Graphite, or if you want the Elastic data sources, they're all open source projects. So the integration with Grafana Labs is open source and freely available. But if you want the integration with some of our commercial competitors, if you want the Dynatrace or Datadog or New Relic or Splunk integration, then we kind of hold the opinion, look, you've already identified yourself as someone willing to pay for observability technology because you're paying our competitors, right? These other vendors. And so we think it's only fair that you pay us some money to visualize that data in Grafana, right? And so we have a small, I think it's like 10% of our data sources are these enterprise data sources. And I actually look at that as a, that was before my time at Grafana Labs, but I look at that as a relatively innovative business model, right? And at that point, very few people had kind of approached the market in that way, right? And that's kind of like, you can innovate in the open source business model, and I think that's a really good example of it.
Amazing. Well, thanks for sharing, Tom. We appreciate it, and really had a nice time speaking with you. My one last question is, what's the most unexpected place you've seen someone use Grafana? I don't think dashboards belong here.
Oh, there's so many really good examples. Like we had a great talk by JAXA, the Japanese Space Agency, at GrafanaCon year before last, about like their use of Grafana, like because all of their dashboards, and we've seen them in the live streams from like SpaceX and other rocket companies. That's always so cool to see, like Grafana being used to send things into space. But I'll tell you a personal story. I was lucky enough to have a tour of the McLaren factory a couple of months ago. I got an invite and I turned up, and it's like going to a candy. It's like a kid in a candy store for me. Like I'm massively into cars, and on the factory floor, where they manufacture their road cars, where they manufacture their supercars and so on, it's big Grafana dashboards with like various stats around, the station and the success of the various processes going on. And I'm like, that is so cool to see a project I work on, being used by someone like McLaren. Like, I just think that's amazing.
That is amazing, indeed. I can only imagine what you were feeling like, Cool. Well, that was a good conversation. Thanks for joining, Tom. I'll leave all the links in the description below. But yeah, check out, just go to grafana.com and you should find everything. And if you're looking to contribute and join the open source community, go to github.com. Cool. See you.
Thanks.